Jonathan Kadmon is a first-year faculty fellow with us at the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Brain Sciences at Hebrew U. He's a neuroscientist. And the title of Jonathan's presentation is A Clockwork Orange Brain. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michal, for the introduction. I just want to apologize first. I'm actually recovering from COVID and I have a bit of a cough. So I might cough a little bit during the presentation. So excuse me. Okay, so maybe I'll start by explaining what's up with this title. Okay, so A Clockwork Orange is the name of a known Stanley Kubrick film. Anthony Burgess, the author of the novel that the film is based on, explained that the name originates from an old Cockney saying, as strange as a clockwork orange, meaning there's something that appears normal on the outside, but is strange on the inside. The brain is arguably the most complex system that we know. All of us have brains and most of us use it, but its inner working is still a mystery. In 2013, former US President Obama announced the Brain Initiative, a national program aimed at better understanding the brain, which he equated to the landing on the moon or sequencing the human genome. In his announcement speech, he said the following: as humans, we can identify galaxies light years away. We can study particles smaller than the atom, but we still haven't unlocked the mystery of the 3 pounds of matter that sits between our ears. The complexity of the brain is not only biological, but also computational. What is the basis of intelligence? How does the brain compute? In recent years, we have seen a Cambrian explosion of artificial intelligence. AI is everywhere, from smarter synthesis and self-driving cars to automated medical diagnosis and scientific research. The technology is inspired by our current understanding of the brain, and these applications actually do display some sort of intelligence. But did we unlock the mystery of the brain? Try telling your Tesla car a joke. While it's an open discussion where we are on the road to true intelligence, one thing is certain. These technologies are a great tool that can help us to understand how the brain works. In my lab, we identified and studied similarities and differences between artificial intelligence systems and the brain. We use the similarities to study artificial systems as brain surrogates. Computers are more accessible and more easily probed than living brains. The differences that we find point us to the uniqueness of the brain. It also allows us to design more brain-like artificial systems. Basically, we write down equations and models for different neural circuits. We then study these models and extract insights on the computations that they perform and their function in the brain. And today, I want to share some of our insights. The ability to perform the precise action at the right time is crucial for behavior and survival. When an antelope sees a lion, it must run immediately, every time. When Jacqueline Dupre plays Beethoven cello concerto to a live audience, she must hit the correct note at the exact time, every time. Luckily, neurons, the building block of the brains, are very reliable. If we take one neuron in isolation and stimulate it, it will fire at specific times. Here at the bottom, we see the magnitude of stimulation over time of the neuron, and the black marks above it mark every time that the neuron responds. If we repeat the same stimulations many times, the neuron will respond at the same time, every time. Neurons behave like clockwork. However, when we record the activity of neurons in the brain, we see something very different. We can stimulate the neurons again and again with the same stimulus. Each time we'll get a different response pattern. The activity of the brain is less clockwork and more like a Jackson Pollock painting. It has an overall vibe to it, but the details are very messy. Now, this is a real puzzle. How does a bunch of consistent neurons lead to such an erratic, unreliable response? How can we expect to get reliable behavior out of it? Why does a brain work like that at all? Now, the antelope needs to run from the lioness every time. On the other hand, its escape course should not be very predictable. The cellist wants to hit that note every time, but perhaps she wants to allow for some improvisation. She may want to compose a new piece from time to time, and when training, a cellist needs to try and experiment with new movements. So the internal variability may play an important role in the overall behavior. But how does a brain do it? How does a brain take neurons that respond like clockwork, create the Jackson Pollock of activity that we observe, and end up producing very reliable behavior? We can turn to mathematical modeling and computer simulation to answer these questions. We start by writing down the equations that describe the activity of neurons when we connect them. We found that when the circuit is large and complex enough, like we would find in the brain, the system becomes chaotic. And what is chaos? We can consider the famous butterfly effect. It argues that the flap of a butterfly's wing in Brazil may influence the course of a hurricane in New York weeks later. In other words, the complexity of the system leads to unpredictable outcomes, even when everything is deterministic. Connecting many clockwork neurons will lead to chaos, and we will observe this Jackson Pollock-like activity that we measure in the brain. But chaotic activity is unpredictable and not a good basis for computation. We want to understand how the brain can tame this chaotic activity and produce precise and reliable behavior. Here we took ideas from control theory. Consider the thermostat in your living room. When the temperature rises, it turns the heat down, and when it becomes colder, the thermostat warms the room. Overall, the room temperature stays stable despite changing or even chaotic weather. This is what we call feedback control. We developed a brain circuit model that implements similar ideas to a chaotic and complex neural system. We show that certain neural pathways in the brain can improve the reliability of the output while maintaining chaotic activity. In other words, we show that the behavior can be precise, like a cello concerto, while the neural activity still looks something like a Jackson Pollock painting. Our brain has different anatomical and functional areas. The neocortex is the largest part of the human brain. It performs sensory processing, motor control, and higher executive cognitive function, and is likely where creativity, for example, originates. The cerebellum, here shown in bluish-greenish color, is often termed the small brain or the little brain. However, it actually holds more neuron than the rest of the brain altogether. It is essential for precise and coordinated movement. It also required for learning of new motor skills. Importantly, those two areas are interconnected and can implement an effective feedback control. In experiments we ran with collaborators at Stanford University, we have shown that when a mouse learned a new motor skill, the two areas, the neocortex and the cerebellum, cooperate to increase reliability and precision of the motion. And both improve together as the mouse perfects the skill. Our finding prompted us to study how those two areas, the neocortex and the cerebellum, learn in tandem. The idea behind our theory is simple. The cortex acts as a pattern reservoir. The chaotic activity acts as a huge corpus of possible outcomes. The cerebellum picks and chooses the relevant patterns that construct the behavior, like building a castle from elementary Lego bricks. Our theory showed that this way of learning new motor skills is very efficient and can allow us to learn both fast and accurately. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." Our work shows that chaos is a crucial ingredient for creativity, efficiency, and learning in the brain. In the film, A Clockwork Orange, or the film is about an internal conflict between a programmed mechanistic behavior and a wild, unpredictable nature. In our work, we show that the brain constantly balances determinism and unpredictability, precision and creativity, order and chaos. Perhaps that's what makes it so unique, a real clockwork orange brain. If you have more questions or want to discuss the ideas further, feel free to reach out, and thank you for your time. Any questions? Yes,
thanks. It was really, really interesting. I have a question. If when you look at organisms with less developed cortex, which from what I understand would have more of a precise and maybe automatic response and not the creativity part, do you really see in their behavior that the behavior is more constricted to more patterned and less creative behavior?
So
more relying on instincts and less maybe on more developed behaviors.
So it's a good question. You ask if basically if we look at organisms that have less developed neocortex, where we said that when chaos appears, do we see more regular behavior? No, I don't know of such behavior, and most animals that we study, which are basically mammals, have this kind of a chaotic network. So I don't know what would happen in a more programmed way. Also, our theory is not the only possible way to learn, but we do think that this pathway, that's cortex or neocortex and cerebellum, that actually developed together throughout evolution. These two areas grew up and became larger and larger together, are important for this. Now, it's hard to measure creativity, but it's known that when one of the parts is missing, for example, if we lesion the cortex or the cerebellum, usually lives find a way. So to your question, I don't have a good answer, and I at the moment I cannot even ask for a good solution on how to measure it in a quantified way. What is less creativity and how to relate it to the connectivity patterns or the activity. But if you have ideas, I'll be happy to hear.
If I look at the antelope example, for example, that you use, that you're saying on one hand she has to escape, on the other hand she has to be creative in the route she chooses. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you could go to a lower organism without a developed neocortex and go to this kind of instinct behavior of running away from danger and see if there's more variation, less variation in how it handles these challenges.
So I mean, even lower organism as a zebrafish still has a cortex-like. We have to go to a much lower. Perhaps the Drosophila fly would be the one thing that we can think of, and we still have randomness there. But in that case, I don't know how this theory would apply for the Drosophila, except that in some areas of the Drosophila brain, we do see similar patterns. Something similar to cerebellum, something similar to cortex, and to, in that case, in the Drosophila, it would be the mushroom body.
But there's still interactions between different parts, even in the Drosophila, that they can coordinate.
There's still similar structures, and it actually relates to the only place that the fly actually learns, which is to learn to respond to new smells. So if we put creativity aside, which is more abstract, at least for the learning part, it could be relevant. Even in those, we think it's relevant even for those lower form organisms. Kirti, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Like you gave two examples that neurons are responsible for actions in two different scenarios. Are they also responsible for emotions, that how we are supposed to feel for certain situations?
I didn't say the word emotion, except maybe in one part as a kind of a general example. I don't know what are the neural correlates of emotions are.
I think but interesting.
Yeah, but for me, all the chaotic activity is not about emotion, but at least from our theory in the last part, it's about creating this corpus of possible options or a possible space of reactions and action or movements, and then thing we can choose and learn from. But I wouldn't go to emotion. That is for me at least, it's less scientific. I don't know how to quantify it.
I think, like according to my observation, I feel like it's pretty scientific, and I think it's also genetic. I have the feeling. So I think that part can be interesting to study, big emotions and how the brain works. Some people feel much more sad than others, and I feel it's also genetic. I mean,
No,
it's my
I'm not saying that studying emotion is not scientific, but I do not know the neural correlates of it. So I wouldn't know how to write models or computational models in neural networks that explains how the neurons affect the emotion. There's a big gap there in our understanding that is missing. It's not, does not allow me to build a theory at least for it at the moment, a neural theory.
Okay. Maybe for future it can be interesting. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Jonathan, I'll just note you have 3 questions and 3 minutes, more or less.
Okay.
So perhaps collect the questions and then answer.
Okay, Raphael.
Yes, I have a question. So if you said that there is a correlation between creativity and less, I don't know, simultaneous activity of the neurons, I think can we increase the creativity of humans by using device which could make more noise? You think it makes sense?
Okay, now we are going into the science fiction realm. Can we do it? I don't know. I don't know how do we temper with the neural activity and what our tempering would do. And it would be interesting, actually. There's ways now to add things to the brain, like grown brain organelles, and connect them. And there are actually some people who do work on that at Stanford, for example, and try to measure them. So it's an interesting question, but our computational theory would just would tell us if the cortex is more chaotic, it might help us to learn a little better, or to retain a larger corpus of outcomes. More?
Hi. So I want to ask, do you know of any other systems outside of the brain that use chaotic activity for learning?
So there's a thing called liquid state machines. This is an idea for machine learning, and they actually rely on some of chaotic activity. And our theory.
But that's just theoretical, right? Computational.
It's computational theoretical, and there are some applications for it, but not these other real application of AI. They don't use it.
No, so I'm not talking about applications. I'm talking about natural systems. Like, do you know any other natural systems that use chaos for learning or information processing?
Well, I don't know a lot of. It's how do you find information processing, and what are more natural systems that learns, right? And except or compute.
Yeah, we can take it over coffee as well later. Virtual coffee.
There are some attempts to use natural things like waves in water, when you learn the shape of the tank they're in order to do some computation, and then they could potentially be used to this kind of learning. But we don't know a lot of natural systems that learn. This is something very unique. Or at least in terms of computation. Of course, our body learns, our genetics learn in some other ways, and maybe the evolution and those random changes in genetics can somehow be translated to similar ideas. But I haven't thought about that deeply.
Okay, thanks.
You have time for more question, or Michal? One more. Okay, Slava?
Okay, I know that if you play cello more, then you get better in creativity. Does it work backwards? If you are very creative, would you be better in reproducibility? Do they affect each other, these two?
So again, creativity here, at least in the theory, I would take it as a more abstract idea. But at least the theory doesn't say that if you become more precise, you lose your creativity or your chaotic. So what part of our theory said that if you use this pathway to control your chaos, your system still remains chaotic. So it wouldn't hurt that. The other way around, I don't know how to measure it.
Great. I think that just about sums it up. Thank you, Jonathan, for your excellent presentation, and thank you everyone for your questions.